Greetings, friends! Andriivka here, and this is the weekly Russian-Ukraine war update for the week of February 10th through February 16th of 2025. And you want to continue receiving these weekly Russian-Ukraine war updates, be sure to subscribe to my channel, give this video a thumbs up, share this video around, and comment your thoughts. And this week we have updates along the entire front, for the most part, and a lot of the back and forth, as usual. Lots of gains for the Russians, a lot of gains for the Ukrainians, so let us talk. First, we're actually going to start again with the South Donetsk area. We are back in this area, and this week, the reason why we are back is because one of the biggest news items, which kind of happened at the very end of this week, and is actually still ongoing, so we can't really make any definitive things yet. Sometimes it's a bit annoying when, like, the biggest issue happens on, like, a Sunday when I'm recording this shit, so that, like, we don't know what the end result is yet, but so we cannot make any definitive things, but for the most part, we can basically say that what they call the Andriivka pocket, the Ulakli-Dachna pocket, is collapsing, or has collapsed. And this pocket has been something that the Russians have been fighting over for the South Donetsk area for the last month and a half, ever since the fall of Kharkov. This was, and now after the fall of Andriivka, this is the first thing, is that the Russians, we talked about how last week the Russians entered the center of Andriivka, were battling for it, and this week the Russians captured the western part of Andriivka. So for the first part of this week, the Russians were battling in Andriivka. They captured the western part of this village, and most sources are saying they also captured, this northern part here. Some sources are saying they're still clearing up this northwestern part, but a lot of pro-Russian sources saying this entire village was captured. So the front line actually kind of looks something like this. And so everything below this red line has been captured, and thus Andriivka has been captured. And we actually have geolocated footage and map changes of that as well, especially in the center part. Now, with the fall of Andriivka, that means that the one of the main defenses that was holding this entire Dachna pocket collapsed. And that means there used to be a continuous front line, and now that the Russians captured Andriivka, they could attack Constantinople from the north here, as well as from the south, as they were doing already. And then, because of the threat to Constantinople, this entire pocket started collapsing. The Russians made a full-scale assault, and the Ukrainians are falling back to Baratar here. And so it looks like this entire pocket, it looks like Ulakli, Constantinople are about to fall, especially by the end of next week, for them, pretty much for sure. So when Andriivka fell during the first, two-thirds of this week, during the last third of this week, the Russians then launched a new attack, which is still ongoing, which is why we don't have exact details yet, or we have details, but we don't have, it's still going on, so there's like a fog of war. But what's happening here? So a lot of Russians, even Ukrainian sources, are saying that the Russians basically, at least everything to the other side of this Mokolaya River, so on the other end of Constantinople, has fallen to the Russians. The Russians are right now battling for Ulakli, and then everything between Dachna and in front of Ulakli has been captured by the Russians. So the Russians, broke into Ulakli. Right now there's clashes going on for Ulakli. Some sources are saying that the Russians already took Ulakli and the Ukrainians fell back to Constantinople. But we don't have but we do have confirmation that the Russians are in Ulakli and are battling for this village. And I won't be surprised with that within a day or two that this village has been captured, and I wouldn't be surprised then afterwards the Russians then collapse onto Constantinople and take it. So, this entire pocket is collapsing. This is one of the biggest things. So Andriivka has fallen. This entire, the Russians, are battling for Ulakli, which allows sort of saying they're already captured. And so this used to be a huge pocket for the Ukrainians. They had a huge pocket here. We talked about how last week the Russians took Dachna, and then, the Ukrainians fell back to Ulakli, and now Ulakli is falling here. And so this entire pocket is collapsing. The Russians are battling for it. And what's going to happen now? So I wouldn't be surprised that by tomorrow even that everything in front of the Mokolaya River here is captured by the Russians. So Ulakli will fall. We'll probably see some flag raising within a day. And then from here, the Russians will then try to, and also what's happening this week is that some sources are saying the Russians already entered Constantinople. The Ukrainians say they got defeated, but some sources are saying the Russians actually entered these farms that are in the southern part of Constantinople and are now, if the Russians could hold on to their positions in the southern part of Constantinople here, then they could put the pressure and try to cross the river from the north here and squeeze it on multiple angles, and then maybe within a few days Constantinople will fall as well, and the Ukrainians will have to fall back to Baratar. And you might be wondering, why not Rosalie? Well, let's say they take Constantinople sometime later this week. So let's say everything behind this red line is captured by the Russians. Then, the Russians will continue pushing, along the Vochka River here. And then suddenly, the Russians will be on the north of Roswell. They'll be on the east of Roswell, and they'll still be in the south of Roswell. In fact, the Russians made some more progress to the south of Roswell here. They captured some more tree lines to the south of Roswell here. So, with the capture of Constantinople, this puts the Ukrainian positions in Roswell in a very precarious situation. So I wouldn't be actually surprised, depending on how fast the Russians go in clearing Constantinople, we could very well see that the Russians, by the end of next week, are storming Roswell in multiple areas, and the Ukrainians will have to fall back to Baratar. And so from there, the Russians will then take Roswell as well. And then everything here, and then the Ukrainians will fall back to a more to where they're exiting the pocket and now have they have their flank secure, so they'll retreat to Alexeyevka and Baratar here. And so this entire I wouldn't be surprised if within a week all these Ulakli, Constantinople, and Rosalie have fall to the Russians. At that point, the Russians might stop, because I don't know if the Russians will continue pushing or they'll have to regroup, because at that point it'll be a bit harder, because then the Ukrainians will no longer be in a pocket. They'll actually have their flanks secured. So it will be a lot easier to defend Baratar and Alexeyevsky as opposed to, Dachna or Ulakli, where the Russians already surrounded them on three sides here. So, yeah, that is one of the biggest news in this. That's why we're starting the South Donetsk area. The Ulakli, Andriivka, whatever you want to call it, the Dachna pocket has collapsed, and now we're gonna probably talk about how the Russians cleared it by the end of next week. But since this just started after the fall of Andriivka, like literally, like yesterday, there is still a lot of fog of war. What's exactly happening? So I don't have exact details, but this is what we're just right now getting reports from the ground. But again, things could change very dramatic. Maybe there's a lot of fog of war happening, but there's a big thing happening here, and a lot of people are saying that this pocket has collapsed. So, and not just Russian sources, but also Ukrainian sources. So yeah, that is what's happening in this kind of more the South Donetsk area. Another place where the Russians actually restarted offensive operations in the South Donetsk area is the Velika-Novosovka axis, and this is where I think that I thought the Russians would stop here. We didn't have any updates in the Velika-Novosovka area for about 2 weeks now or so, and I thought, okay, they took Velika-Novosovka, they finished, they're not going to do anything here. They're going to drag all their forces from here to maybe Pokrovsk or some shit. But that's not what happened. And this week the Russians have restarted operations in the west of Velika-Novosovka, and so let's talk about what happened. So now, a lot of this is advancements in the fields. It's not as sexy, but things are happening. So the first thing that happened, let's talk about more the north here, is the Russians are pushing and trying to conquer the fields between Rosenthal and Novokamar. So, for example, we talked about how the Russians took one of the biggest trench networks on this area in the west of Rosenthal. Some Russian sources are also saying they took these tree lines in the north of Novokamar. And so it's looking like the Russians are just trying to basically take some of these fields between Novokamar and Rosenthal just to flatten the front here a little bit. So that's what they're doing here. Not only that, one of the biggest informations that are coming out is that the Russians have entered the village of Novocherchernya and crossed the Volkhaya River and entered the southern part of this village. So we got a lot of sources are saying that, even Ukrainian sources, so they've entered here. So we shall see if the Russians manage to actually take this village and if they could establish a solid bridgehead here. If so, what's going to happen, and the reason why they're doing this is if you look at, there is something, the Ukrainians built a lot of trench networks on a more higher ground here in these fields here in Brulaski. So there's a bunch of trench networks that are around right here. They're not extremely they're not extremely well fortified, but there are various trenches there, and it's very highly defensive. But if the Russians manage to capture these two villages here, they could actually try to outflank Suchka and Novochercherny here. And this is actually why they're probably advancing here to to protect their flank here. Is that as the Russians advance from the south here, they could actually try to outflank or attack the flank of these trench networks in around Brulaski here. So that is probably where the main aim is to take these trench networks to the northwest of Velika-Novosovka. So we shall see if the Russians could take Novochercherny and then Sukhina and establish some positions here. But that is what's happening. They are now crossing the river to the north of Novokomar and trying to take these two villages. But where the Russians are also, where they actually made a bunch of advances, is in the south here. And so this, or to the west here, I should say. And so let's talk about it. So first, the Russians took a bunch of areas to the north of Vermivka. So they've cleared a lot of these fields to the north of Likhnosova and Vermivka. Not only that, they are now crossing this road and have captured a bunch of tree lines to the north of this road as well, so they're advancing. And not only that, they captured, and then more to the west here, they have reached this kind of small little reservoir here and took a lot of the, a lot of these fields that are to the west here. And then not only that, we actually got some confirmation, even according to pro-Ukrainian sources, that the Russians have taken the village of Novoselivka here. Ukrainians are saying there's going to be counterattacks here, and so the Russians won't be able to hold on to this, so we'll have to see if the Russians could hold on. But right now, the Russians have entered this village, and if the Ukrainians can't take them out, then this is a good gain for the Russians in Novoselivka here. So now it looks like the Russians have taken everything along this road, so now they could use Novoselivka to supply their troops and have this be a new base of operations as they push forward here. So obviously what's going to happen now is, my guess is the Russians are going to try to focus on the village of Linopolia and Perlinia here. This is, the Russians will probably keep advancing, trying to reach this tree line. The Russians will try to, move along, tree line once at a time, trying to reach here. They might try to do maybe a big push and try to, take these two villages, because if they could take these two villages and take everything here, and if we look at the big picture here, as they try to take the Brulasky trench networks here, so if they take something like this, then they could attack it on multiple angles and then take these trench networks and then take Brulasky, and then they'll have a very good solid position here. So this is probably the short-term tactical goals for the Russians here. The main purpose here is to advance towards the village of Kamar. If you look, let me show off the Donetsk Oblast here. So this is the Donetsk Oblast. So technically, even though they took the two biggest Ukrainian supply nodes in South Donbass, there is still, everything underneath that line is still part of Donbass technically. And so, the Russians are trying to reach the village of Kamar, which is smaller, is small relatively speaking, but it's still now, they still need to take, in terms of trying to take everything of Donbass, they still need to take everything here. So the Russians are going to continue advancing, in this area, and try to also link up with the Russians who are going to be advancing towards Baratar and moving along the Multidai River, and they're going to try to encircle Kamar. So slowly but surely, they're going to advance here. I'm pretty certain the Russians will then try to take the village of Zelenopol and Novopil, and try to, just kind of have more positions here. And then from here, they'll also try to advance towards Shentenko and Visola. And then from here, the Russians will then try to advance through these fields to try to cut off Kamar from the west, and then the Russians will obviously be here and try to reach the village of Ordodotny here and Baratar and try to encircle Kamar from multiple angles here. So it's a bit of a big operation to take Kamar. It's going to probably bleed into spring, but this is where probably the goal of the Russians will be, is to reach Kamar, and then once Kamar falls, the Russians will then continue advancing till they reach this Vochka River here. So they'll just take everything along this river, and also they're also trying to advance towards Novopavlovka in this Pokrovsk direction. So if you look at, they're going to probably try to use these rivers as natural defenses. So if you want to have a river that like a red line to show where the Russians will advance towards, it'll be something like this. Something like that. So the Russians will then probably have to flatten their front line along the Donetsk Oblast right here. So this is where the Russians are going to try to push towards in this entire South Donetsk area, is to take everything up here, because this goes along the river, and then the Ukrainians have some very good positions to defend Dnipro Oblast in Prozasnya, Pokrovsky, Mezovska. So they'll have some very good defensive positions in the front of in the Dnipro Oblast, but the Russians, they're just trying to take the rest of South Donbass here. So yeah, they restarted their offensive operations in the south of Donbass, and we shall see if the Russians could continue developing their success here. Alrighty, and there's been no changes in the Zaporozhye or Kherson directions. Alrighty, now let us go to the Pokrovsk direction. This is where the Ukrainians are having a lot of interesting progress. The Ukrainians are gonna. The Ukrainians have stopped the Russian progress here. The Russians are fighting back the Ukrainian counterattacks, but the Ukrainians are counterattacking here. So this is actually at least in this western part, up near Pokrovsk itself, is where the Ukrainians are pushing back a lot. So first, according to pro-Ukrainian sources, the Ukrainians pushed the Russians out of the industrial zone and the farms in the north and east of Kotelina here. Now, we don't have actually any geolocated footage of that. We just have map updates. So we have to keeping our eye here. So the Ukrainians are, we had some sources say the Ukrainians entered the southern part of Kotelina, but then we got geolocated footage of the Russians still being here. So it looks like the southern part of Kotelina is still under Russian control. But we have to wait to see if the Ukrainians actually took back this industrial zone. If so, then the Russian positions in Kotelina are in a very precarious situation because this was one of the best defensive networks they could use to defend Kotelina. Now they're just in a small little village with some one-story buildings here. But the Ukrainians are doing counterattacks here, trying to push the Russians away from Kotelina. However, so the battle for Kotelina is now going in the Ukrainian favor. However, where the Russians also have favor is in Pashana. So we talked about how this is where the Ukrainians were focusing before. Now it looks like they moved towards Kotelina, but it looks like the Russians diverted their troops here, which might be why Kotelina was able to why the industrial zone was able to get taken. The reason for that is because it looks like the Russians focused on pushing Ukrainians out of Pashana, and according to pro-Russian sources, they pushed the Ukrainians out, and according to pro-Ukrainian sources, they still have positions in Pashana. That being said, Pashana is still where the Russians and Ukrainians are still battling it out. So we have geolocated footage of the Russians being in this industrial zone, but we also have geolocated footage of the Ukrainians being in the school. So there's a lot of back and forth in Pashana. So the battle for Pashana is still ongoing. The battle for Kotelina is still going back and forth. So but this is one of the areas where the Russians aren't just advancing. The Russians are battling back, but the Ukrainians are also battling back. So we don't exactly, so Kotelina and Pashana are the main areas, and the Ukrainians really want to take this. The main goal here is probably try to eliminate the salient to save Western Pokrovsk, because the main goal was to take Pashana, according to pro-Russian sources. They were trying to take Pashana, and then using Pashana, they were going to try to break through here and cut off the Russian positions in Udashina and Kotelina, force them to retreat back to Novotoretska and Shentemko, and have this kind of be the new front line, and the Ukrainians could take these area back. But the Russians really do not want to give that up. We also talked one thing where the Russians are also having some progress. Some mappers have changed their maps, in that the eastern part of Udashina has fallen. Most Russians, even some Ukrainian sources are saying that the eastern part of Udashina has fallen. So it looks like the Ukrainians' defenses in Udashina are slipping a little bit, but they still control about 2/3 of the village. So, but the Russians still have positions in Udashina, so that's good for them, but they are slipping in Kotelina. So I don't expect there to be a lot of progress in this area, because this is where the Ukrainians are assembling a bunch of troops here, and they are doing a bunch of counteroffensives here. Another area that the Ukrainians are doing counterattacks is in Dashnitsa. So, the Russians are trying to hold on to these positions in the north here. And so, apparently the Ukrainians did a counterattack to try to retake the village of Dashnitsa, and they actually entered this village, but the Russians pushed them out back to Listovka. So the Ukrainians actually have some positions in Lisivka, and this is where they're trying to do counterattacks here. So, it looks like the Ukrainians are trying to hold on to Pokrovsk as much as possible. This is a very big game. This is one of the biggest fortresses of Western Donbass. But the Russians pushing here are slowed down dramatically, and we shall see how this counterattacks continue going, if it will favor Ukraine or Russia. In the more southern direction, this is where the Russians are pushing. This is where the Ukrainians don't seem to be pushing the Russians back. Most sources are saying that everything to the east of this highway has been taken by the Russians, so everything you see here has been taken by the Russians. So now the Russians have a good position with a highway that could supply their troops in Andriivka if they want to supply it from the north, but they also have supplies with a smaller road to the east here. Anyway, but this highway gives them better positions now that they've captured it. Also, one of the main battles is now going on for the village of Perobojanovka here. The village of Zaporozhye. Most sources are saying that after the fall of Srebrenica last week, that the Russians have taken this entire village, which is easy. It's like one road, so it obviously was going to not take as long to take Zaporozhye. But some sources are saying that this village has been captured, and a lot of sources are saying that some fields to the north of Andriivka, so most specifically these fields to the south of Andriivka, have been captured. And from the looks of it, the Russians are basically trying to solidify their gains in Zaporozhye, solidify their gains in these fields, and then attack Andriivka on multiple angles and take it. So that then their main positions will have something like this here. And then the Ukrainians will have to fall back to their last lines of defense in Toresky, Horokovka, and Kotorodivka in front of Dnieper. And this is the last. These are the last villages before the Russians could reach Dnieper Oblast. So, but considering how precarious their situation is here, I wouldn't be surprised if the Russians, once they take this village, they might maybe stop even, because they'll need to solidify their gains or try to push back the Ukrainian counterattacks here. We still don't have any clear idea of the status of Uspensky as well. Accordingly, the pro-Russian sources say this village was taken, but we don't actually have any flags raising, and we don't have any more updates this week. So we still don't know what's happening in Uspensky. Alrighty, that is the Pokrovsk direction. Now let us go to the Torets direction, and actually the main area in this Torets direction here is less about Toretsk and more in the Minigrad area, this area here. And this is actually where the Russians are also have restarted, or not restarted, but this is where the Russians have now increased their counterattacks here and having a lot of progress. So the main thing is, if you compare the maps here, there's been a lot of progress. One of the main things is the Russians are blooming to the west here, trying to, again, the main purpose here, I've been talked about this before, but the Russians with the forces in Torres are trying to make a giant encirclement of this giant pocket here. And to do that, they need to encircle them from multiple angles and reach this reservoir. And at least on the more western side, they are doing a lot of progress in that area. So let's talk about it. First, the Russians have completely captured the village of Vodana Durova and Berezivsky here. So there's been a lot of there was the Russians took this village and this village and captured a lot of these fields between Baranivka and these villages. So these fields right here. And so the capture of these two villages is a very good stepping stone. Prevents, gives them a solid position to try to ward off any Ukrainian counterattacks from the north. And because of the capture of these two villages, it looks like the Russians have finally managed to get a solid position on and cutting this highway between Minigrad and Konstantinovka. So most mappers are now very confident in saying that the Russians have positions along this highway, and actually managed to capture more parts of this, like kind of like farmlands between Vozhezhenivka and the highway here. So a lot of pro-Russian sources are saying they're about to storm the village of Malinivka here, trying to enter at least the eastern outskirts of this village. And the main thing is that apparently the Ukrainians are making a very big attack to try to hold on to the village of Yelizavzivki or whatever the fuck. But in any case, so the Russians couldn't take this village directly, so they're trying to outflank it from the north here. So this might be, if they could take the eastern part of Malinivka here, they could then storm this area from multiple angles and try to take this village finally from the Ukrainians. And this would solidify their western defenses here a little bit. Now, it's still an open question where the Russians will push. It looks like the Russians are focusing on trying to create a pocket here instead of trying to encircle Minigrad from the east here. But I do think the Russians will take some more villages on the east here, but I don't think they're going to start trying to encircle Minigrad. I think the Russians are going to use the forces here to focus on pushing north here. So, along with this, the Russians have captured the village of Zelenia Polia. So they have captured, this village is pretty small, but they have taken it. So everything here has been taken by the Russians. So this is actually a very big position. They advanced north on Barnivka, which they took about 2 weeks ago, and took this village. And now one of the main goals that the Russians are going to try to do here is try to take the village of Tarasky here. This is one of the biggest goals for the Russians, and also Nova Polatvka here. So from this point, the Russians are going to try to storm the village of Tarasky. So we could see that the Russians have positions in the west of this village and to the east here. So, they're not only going to attack it directly from Zelenia Polia, but they're also going to try to reach this road to try to cut off Tarasky, take some of these villages, and also enter the village of Novopalovka here. And from here, they'll be able to, and then they'll also try to expand northwards, try to take this tree line perhaps. And the main goal here is to take Tarasky, maybe even take Alexandropolia here. So, one thing I could envision here is what the Russians are going to try to do, if you look at the bigger scope here, and, where the Russians are going to be focusing for the next 2-3 weeks, is to try to take these positions here. And then if they could do that, then as you can see, then they could there's this reservoir that moves northwards here and then goes into like a river here and enters the reservoir to the north. And so the Russians are going to use this reservoir as a defense node. There's also a little bit of reservoir here, so this will allow them to take Novolanivka here, try to take something like this. And then from here, the Russians will continue advancing along this reservoir and try to, link up with the Russian troops from Tursk in Alexandra Kolonova here. But as you can see, even if they reach Alexandropolva, Tarasky, and Novopalovka, this creates a more dangerous, continues making dangerous positions for the Ukrainians here. Because, then let's say the Russians, reach Klunobalka, Kateriniivka, and start trying to reach Alexandra Kolonova here. And if they can reach it, then they cut off the highway that supplies it, and then if they could take this cuts off this road, and then suddenly all roads that connect the forces here will be taken. My guess is that if the Russians, take Karanabalka, and take these villages, then the Ukrainians are going to start doing a small retreat from this area. They're going to slowly, step by step, they might give up Alexandropolovka, they might give up Kelanovo, they might retreat back to Zornia and Romovka, and just slowly, step by step, pull back because they don't want to be put into encirclement. They fight until they know they're going to lose, but so I expect that, I don't think there's going to be a pocket that forms here. The Russians are going to slowly but surely constrict, and then the Russians are going to, all the Ukrainian forces that are in this pocket are going to retreat to Alexandra Kolonova here, and there'll be a big battle for this village. But the main point here, the main goal here, obviously, is to, capture this entire pocket and have the front line go something like this here, as I mentioned before. So everything below this red line will be taken soon. Well, not soon, but, within maybe 2 months or so, maybe 3. So that is a lot of big progress in this area. The Russians are blooming in this area, and we shall see if the Russians could do their goal of taking Tarasky and Novopalovka. Alrighty, and then in for Tursk itself, this is after the capture of Tursk itself. It seems like there's been a massive slowdown in operations in this area, but there's been some progress here, mostly in the village of Sherebrenka. Most sources are saying that the Russians have captured more of these northern streets here in northern Sherebrenka. My big question is, is this part of Sherebrenka's worse, or is this part of Novospatsky? So there's 2 villages here. So there's we see Sherebrenka here, but there's still a bunch of areas here. Don't know if this is part of the town, but probably is. But anyway, this area right here is being contested by the Russians, and the Russians probably already have this area, and the Ukrainians probably retreated back to the more northern houses. So yeah, the Russians are trying to improve their position in Sherebrenka, and that is what's happening in the Tourette's direction. Alrighty, now let's go to the Chasov Yar direction, and there's actually not been that much changes in this area. The only change in Chasov Yar, it seems like the Russians are regrouping here, because there hasn't been actually much changes in Chasov Yar, but the main thing to talk about, according to some pro-Russian sources, are in the south here. A lot of sources are saying that the Russians have taken the hills that are in front of the village of Stupochki here. And so this gives the Russians the high ground here. So a lot of these hills in front of Stupochki have been captured according to pro-Russian sources, and they're saying they're preparing to storm this village, which is a very good village to take, because this helps helps them take the village of Mykolivka, which obviously is part of the whole Chasov Yar operation. But besides taking some fields in the south here, the village of Stupochki is now a bit more in danger. But that is all that's happening in the Chasov Yar direction. And then in the Seversk direction, we got some more geolocated footage. The Russians have positions in the western part of Bilogorivka. This village, as you can see, is a moonscape. But yeah, we have geolocated footage of the Russians being here. The biggest thing the Russians need to do is to fully captured this mountain here, this chalk hole, and this forest right here. We had confirmation like 3 weeks ago of the Russians pushing here, but if the Russians could take this forest and this hill right here, so if they could take everything here, then they could actually fully secure Bilogorivka, and the Ukrainians will have to fall back towards out of this area. So, but in order, just advancing in Bilogorivka is not enough. The Ukrainians still have positions in this forest and in this chalk factory, or not factory, chalk mountain. Alrighty, now let us go to the Le Mans direction, and in the Le Mans direction there is small gains here as well. The main thing that's happening in the Le Mans direction is the Russians have completely captured the village of Yampolovka. This has not been confirmed per se, but we actually have geolocated footage of the Russians being in the southern part of Yampolovka. We don't have any like we don't have a source that's saying okay, it is officially captured, but maybe they just need to capture these few houses left. But basically, the village of Yampolovka has fallen to the Russians, and the main goal here, obviously, is to, once they take Yampolovka, the Russians will then be able to advance from their positions on their bridgehead here, take the village of Mirnia, and then they could have, they could supply, have another supply node here. And then from here, they could finally outflank one of the biggest goals, which is Dozivsky here. Instead of trying to attack it directly, which has failed, the Russians could then attack it from the south and from the east, and then try to take this village, which will give a better stronghold for the Russians here. Yeah, so that's the Le Mans direction. Nothing else has happened here. So yeah, let us continue on to the Kupiansk direction. In the Kupiansk direction, there's been no changes in the southern part of Kupiansk, which is weird. Nothing's happened there for about a month now. But where there is some changes, again, is our favorite Dorishnya bridgehead. In the Dorishnya bridgehead, the Russians are continuing expanding their positions here. As you can see, this is a very chunky bridgehead, and it's expanding every week. And this week, the Russians have expanded their positions mostly in the north, and this week, the Russians have taken these fields that are between Dorishnya and Fyodorivka. We talked about the Russians took this village last week, but this week they took more positions to the east, between these this town and this village. And this gives them a better position to defend these this Dorishnya from the north. Most sources have also confirmed that they have taken these tree lines to the north of Novomalinska. This gives them a better positions here. We also have some geolocated footage in the north here that the Russians are activating in the Tolonopilia area, and some sources are saying that the Russians have actually entered this village. So there's some battles going on here. It looks like the Russians have crossed the Russian-Ukraine border and are battling for this village. So it looks like they're actually trying to activate and create a huge bridgehead here, and we'll have to see how it develops here. But this is a very solid position so far. They also have advanced in the fields between Dorishnya and Zapana. So before they took this highway, and this week they actually captured more of these fields to the north of this highway. So this defends Dorishnya from the south here a little bit better. I think they also took this tree line right here. So, nothing, they haven't taken a village. It's not as sexy. That's not, when we talk about advancements, when they take a tree line, it's not as sexy as them taking like a town or something. But it is important for the tactical positioning, because from the looks of it, the Russians will probably try to advance towards the village of Dorosivki here, try to advance to the village of Dononivki here, and, try to advance into this forest. And one of the main goals is to reach the village of Bananalivka here. So the Russians are expanding this very rapidly, and I wouldn't be surprised if the Russians maybe even take something like this in the near future here. So this is, the Russians are just expanding their northern bridgehead a lot. And the biggest goal, the biggest position, the biggest question is, will they focus on northern Kupiansk, which is what I think is going to happen, or are they going to actually start advancing, try to reach the Seversky Donetsk reservoir here, and try to cut off this entire northern Kharkov Oblast here? So yeah, that is the Kupiansk area. We shall see how that bridgehead develops. We're now going to actually move to the Kharkov direction and the Kursk direction for the final part of this video. And actually, for the first time in like months, we actually have some changes in the Kharkov direction, but not much, as you would expect. The biggest thing is we have positions that the Russians have taken the school here in the western part of Volchansk here. I have no clue why the Russians aren't at least able to take the northern part of Volchansk. Yeah, but this village has been razed to the ground. There's nothing left here. Volchansk was a city, but now it is no more. There's just a bunch of rubble. I think it's been reduced to such an extent that there's nothing left here. So, according to some geolocated footage, the Russians have captured this area of Volchansk. But that is it. Alrighty, now let us go to the Kursk direction, and this is where the Russians are also, this is where the Ukrainians had some, remember we talked about the Ukrainian counterattack last week, but now it is the Russians that are on the attack and beating the Ukrainians back. One of the biggest thing is that the Russians can completely capture the village of Serododovko here, and the fields to the west here. We actually have a bunch of geolocated footage of the Russians being in Serododovko here. So, and have captured a bunch of these fields there. So now they could use this highway, this road, to supply their positions in Serododkovko. And with the capture of this village, this puts Ukrainian positions in Suchka in a very precarious situation because they're getting closer and closer to this highway, which they can continue droning, because this is the only highway that supplies Ukrainian positions here. In any case, the Russians have also nullified all the Ukrainian counterattack gains for the most part from last week, and most sources are saying that the Russians have completely recaptured the village of Fantasia and Cherkassy Konopolnovko, and so they have captured these villages back. And the only thing that the Ukrainians have is their positions in Manonovko, and they have positions still in the southern Suchka suburbs. So they still managed to push the Russians out of southern Suchka, but the Russians have taken back some of these villages that the Ukrainians took. That is the end of the gains on the map. I made a video recently about how about Trump's peace plan. There's a lot of peace conferences going on. The Putin and Trump talked. Zelensky's talking about giving a mineral agreement. Now it seems like Putin and Trump are going to talk in Saudi Arabia. So there is a lot of talks going on, and I talked about why having a peace deal would be a strategic defeat for Russia, but that was a video I already made, so listen to that video. Alrighty, that is the end of this video. Hope you guys enjoyed this video. If you want to continue receiving these weekly Russian-Ukrainian war updates, be sure to subscribe to my channel, give this video a thumbs up, comment your thoughts, and share this video around. So aim high and wander on.